Has anyone ever said something to you that resonated like an echo in your head? It was one sentence, and it has stayed with me 30 years and counting. As a young lady, I knew a couple in their 50s, two men who had shared many wonderful years together, until one of them had a brain hemorrhage at work one day. Tom was never the same after his hemorrhage. He regressed into a childlike state, perhaps a child of 12. His conversations were superficial and simple, he couldn't sit still, he'd have tantrums, and he had to be supervised for his own safety. He was a lovely guy, and it always felt odd having to talk to a grown man like he's a child. His partner continued to live with him, but of course, any romance was now strictly off the table. It was more of a carer/patient relationship. I watched this partner struggle for years caring for Tom. He suffered from depression, sadness, loneliness. Every time I had a private conversation with him, his exasperated expression would nearly alive me. He desperately wanted his old life back. He wanted freedom, fun, adult conversations and romance. But, to put it bluntly, he was instead trapped in a nightmare, caring for a child. That is not to say there weren't still some good times for him. He had money, lots of friends, he and Tom traveled, he made the most of life. As they weren't married, and as Tom had family he was very close to, I sometimes wondered why his care hadn't been relinquished to them, or to a care home. I'd seen married people abandon their partner for much less, so why was Tom's partner putting himself through this? One day, I delicately asked him why, expecting he'd just put it down to love. Truth is that love had probably left the building ages ago. The integrity in his answer impacted me greatly, because it's a simple act of fairness rarely demonstrated in some relationships and friendships. Because he would have done the same for me. Have you ever told a ridiculous lie just to see how someone would react? 20 plus years ago I was ordered to lie to my buyer or lose my job. I was ordered by my boss despite my protests. The company I worked for had just won a major contract to sell light globes through one of the largest hardware chains in Australia, Mitre 10. However, we were very much behind schedule, having had a number of delays already. Many times I had been in to my buyer to let him know of our latest delay, and his patience was wearing thin and my boss knew it. She asked me to lie and blame the latest delay on an earthquake in Japan, our globes were coming from India, or any other lie I could come up with as long as it wasn't the company's fault, as in it had to be a force majeure. I made an appointment with my buyer and sat across from him and literally told him this: Peter, as you know, our globes are coming from India. The ship left on time and the order was 100% filled and packed in a shipping container. Unfortunately, inside the same container was a cage containing a couple of Bengal tigers. They escaped their cage and have unfortunately ripped or damaged all of the light globe packaging. But we could fix that by having new packaging made and printed here in Australia, except that, also in the same container was an Indian elephant. This elephant also escaped its cage and has trampled all the globes. Not one globe was left intact. The entire shipment was destroyed. She's told you to lie to me, didn't she? He said after listening to me spin this ridiculous lie. He knew full well what was going on. We got on very well, he knew me and what I stood for. We stayed in contact for many years after we both left our respective positions. He knew the position my boss had forced me into. After asking me for a new ADA, he told me to leave. He wasn't happy. But I did what I was ordered to do and did it in a way that kept my reputation intact. Have you ever told a ridiculous lie just to see how someone would react? 20 plus years ago I was ordered to lie to my buyer or lose my job. I was ordered by my boss despite my protests. The company I worked for had just won a major contract to sell light globes through one of the largest hardware chains in Australia, Mitre 10. However, we were very much behind schedule, having had a number of delays already. Many times I had been in to my buyer to let him know of our latest delay, and his patience was wearing thin and my boss knew it. She asked me to lie and blame the latest delay on an earthquake in Japan, our globes were coming from India, or any other lie I could come up with as long as it wasn't the company's fault, as in it had to be a force majeure. I made an appointment with my buyer and sat across from him and literally told him this: Peter, as you know, our globes are coming from India. The ship left on time and the order was 100% filled and packed in a shipping container. Unfortunately, inside the same container was a cage containing a couple of Bengal tigers. They escaped their cage and have unfortunately ripped or damaged all of the light globe packaging. But we could fix that by having new packaging made and printed here in Australia, except that, also in the same container was an Indian elephant. This elephant also escaped its cage and has trampled all the globes. Not one globe was left intact. The entire shipment was destroyed. She's told you to lie to me, didn't she? He said after listening to me spin this ridiculous lie. He knew full well what was going on. We got on very well, he knew me and what I stood for. We stayed in contact for many years after we both left our respective positions. He knew the position my boss had forced me into. After asking me for a new ADA, he told me to leave. He wasn't happy. But I did what I was ordered to do and did it in a way that kept my reputation intact. I hired a private investigator to scare my husband. I pulled this on my husband, soon to be ex. We had been married for 15 years. I had just given birth to our second child. I knew he wasn't happy about our first child and he let it be known he didn't want the second. Everything was fine until we had kids, then he started doing his own thing and treating me horribly. I was sick with worry, trying to work, and was taking care of the home and children alone. One day, I got a call from a guy who told me that he had a private investigator follow his wife and my husband. He had proof of their affair and his evidence fit. I believed him. After a long talk, he said that he wanted to save his marriage and asked what he could do to break them up. I told him, simple. My soon-to-be ex, I knew I was done at this point, is a big coward. You just need to call him and scare him, he said. I can do better than that. This guy was a building contractor. He loaded a bunch of his biggest guys on his crew in his truck and they were waiting to catch my ex at his favorite hangout. He flew home that night frightened out of his wits. First time we had seen him before 9 p.m. since the baby was born. He wanted all the doors and windows shut that night. The next morning, he woke up to all the blinds and windows opened. I had pulled his truck out of the garage and into the front so my son could ride his trike. This really put him in a panic. He also wanted the phone off the hook, but somehow it was hung back up. He jumped every time it rang. I actually got my sister to call and hang up several times. The contractor called to thank me and asked if he could do anything to help me. I had one favor to ask. He said with pleasure. When we went to divorce court, my attorney presented all of the evidence collected by the private investigator. My ex had no idea this was coming and his attorney sat down and put his hands over his eyes. If my husband's mistress shows up at his funeral, how should I respond? Do I ignore her, pretend, or look the other way? This is an odd story of mine, life-changing at the time. My mother was involved with a man when I was 11, my parents having divorced a year or so earlier. My siblings and I liked him, he was friendly and patient and really seemed to like us. He had 2 children of his own, younger than me, that I had never met. We knew he was married to someone else, but theoretically was in the process of getting a divorce. From our point of view he lived in the basement of his house, which was about 5 miles away from our house. We had started getting thinly veiled threats from the wife in various ways, fire department showing up to rescue us from imaginary house fires, the wife showing up on our doorstep asking if we had her dog, weird phone calls, stuff like that. One day, he and my mom were getting ready to leave to go somewhere. He counted out about $200 on the table in front of me, and told me he was going to give it to his wife for child support. They left, and about 2 hours or so later my mom came back in his car, hysterical. She crying that his wife had shot him. I tend to be an optimist, so I assumed my mom was overreacting, something had happened, but I was sure it would turn out okay. About an hour after that, a CHP officer showed up at the door. He was a friend, our next door neighbor from our old neighborhood. He stepped in and just said to my mom, he didn't make it, and then we were all crying. The next few months were so dark, and the wife was arrested and being held in the county jail, but a funeral was planned. My mom wanted to go, though this did not seem like a good idea. And she went. Unfortunately, the deputies also brought the wife, in handcuffs. As soon as she saw my mom, she went off, screaming about how that beach shouldn't be there. Yelling a lot. The authorities thought it better that my mom leave, and asked her to wait in another room. After the funeral, they brought her in for a private viewing, where she was able to cry alone with the body. It meant a lot to her. After so many years, I'm not sure if any of this is altered in my mind. I expect if the mistress shows up she might get screamed at, but I also sort of expect that she might have some reason to be there. What did you find out about your teacher that shocked you? When I was 10 years old, I disappointed my parents so severely that my mom actually told me that she was ashamed of me. We had a new teacher at school, a young and attractive woman who I didn't particularly like. There was a weekly magazine and TV guide that always featured a naked woman who was chosen from readers who sent in their pictures. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. Another kid happened to find an old edition of the magazine that featured our new teacher as the weekly babe. We convinced one teacher that another had sent us to make copies of some worksheets, and made about 100 copies of the picture. We distributed them all around the school. The teacher was around 25 years old, and the pictures were taken years earlier, when she was just 17. This wasn't before the internet existed, but it was before it evolved into the black hole of revenge porn and shame that it is today. She had no reason to think that the old picture would come back to haunt her nearly a decade later, and she was shocked and humiliated. When I close my eyes, I can still see my parents' faces the way they looked when they were called to the school and informed of my actions. It was so painfully clear that they couldn't believe I'd let them down like that. Yes, I discovered something shocking about my teacher, and my immature reaction was to share it with the world for my own amusement. It has been more than 1 year, and I swear that writing this is making me turn red with shame. What is the creepiest, most blood-chilling thing you or someone you know have ever experienced? My mom had a stalker for years. She was maybe in her early 30s, I was about 3 and my brother was around 1 when this started. My dad would leave for work in the morning, and as soon as he was gone, the calls would start coming in. She'd answer the phone and some guy would be saying all this horribly sadistic and intimate things about what he wanted to do to my mom. She was beyond frightened and didn't know what to do. Sometimes the caller would describe what she was wearing at that very minute or describe what she was doing. My parents were struggling financially so they couldn't just up and move, but my mom started spending more and more time at my dad's mother's house when he was away. The cops got involved but they couldn't trace the call. Finally, they were able to save up enough money to move. I was about 6 by this time. The phone number was changed and unlisted in the phone book. This was around 1988 when everyone still used landlines. My mom never got another scary phone call, but she had nightmares about it for years. When I was little, I remember going into her bedroom in the morning and she would be sobbing into her pillow. I didn't understand it at that point, but she explained later in life that she'd wake up from a nightmare and just shake and cry. A couple months after we had moved, the cops informed us that they finally caught the guy. It was our next-door neighbor's 19-year-old son. He had been in the military but was discharged due to severe mental illness. I guess he was put into some sort of special security home that specializes in mental health. The lead investigator said that the son was obsessed with my mother and they found a box in his room full of a bunch of photographs candidly taken of her when she was out in the garden or playing with us kids in the yard. It chills me to the bone when I think about it now. Anything could have happened to my mother when my dad was at work and it'd be too young to help her.